Hey, my name is Devin Calvert, and I am a K-3 art educator in Milton, Wisconsin. Milton is kind of in like south central Wisconsin, not too far from the Illinois border. I am also the president of the Wisconsin Art Education Association, and I am currently in my sixth year of teaching art. Um, and I am here today to present to you on incorporating contemporary art into the elementary classroom. I've been doing that for about 5 years now, so I've started to really kind of get the hang of it, and I have a large library of contemporary artists that I teach. So I thought it'd be great if I shared that with you guys. I do have my different ways to contact me. I have my school email address as well as my president's email address. I'm also active on most social media, so you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I will try to provide you with this PowerPoint so you can actually click on these hyperlinks and have them take you straight to my page. I also have a YouTube page. I've been doing a flip classroom, so videotaping my demos for 5 years now. So I have probably about 250 demo videos on my website that you are welcome to use. I have them all broken down by the artist, and then within each playlist, I have each day of that artist setup as well as any resource videos that I use. So you could literally show up on a Monday, pull up my YouTube page, and just hit play and have me explain to each of your students how to do that project. And that should have almost every project that I've ever taught. So most of the projects you're going to see me explain today will be in there as well as plenty of others. And then I also do have a website. When you go to that website, it's not only my portfolio, my personal portfolio, it also has my curriculum that I teach on there. So most of these projects that you're going to see, I have some kind of a blog write-up under the curriculum section. And in those sections, I'll walk you through each individual day, like what I talked about, what I did for that project that certain day. So if you do decide to do some of these projects and kind of need the instructions, that's a great place to go. So as I said, I've been doing contemporary art for about 5 years. A lot of people ask me, well, why did you decide to make that switch? I wanted my students to really have an appreciation for things that were happening right now in the art world. When I talked to my students, typically the first thing that they would ask me when I introduced a new artist was, when did this artist die? And that got to be a really annoying question. I just kind of wanted to put the kibosh on that because it felt like they only viewed artists as something from the past, that they weren't actually working professionals today. So by incorporating these contemporary artists into my classroom, students don't ask me anymore, when did this artist die? They ask me, how old is this artist? They want to know, is that artist younger than their mom? Is that artist older than their dad? They're much more attuned to these artists because they can actually picture themselves as an artist now. It's not something that used to happen. It's something that's currently occurring in our world. And because it's currently occurring, it's relevant to them. These things matter. They're dealing with issues that are happening today that are relevant. And because these things are more relevant, it really increases the buy-in. And when you have more buy-in, frankly, you're going to have less redirection. So I've actually seen a change in my students' behavior. I'm not having to redirect students to be on task. They're just more naturally engaged in my projects. And speaking for myself, it also keeps me up to date on my content knowledge. Okay, most of us had art history classes in college where we learned about all those dead white European men. Okay, and then we kind of never really touched those artists again. We just kind of teach the same artist year after year. Well, by teaching contemporary artists, I've had to go and I've had to research these artists. I've had to find them. I've had to use different sources. It keeps me on my A game because there's always new artists being introduced into our world. So it helps me kind of understand the art world that's happening right now. Kind of keeps me on top of my game. As you might have heard me say, I said dead white European men. Okay? A lot of artists don't look like me. A lot of our students don't look like me. Okay? So by introducing contemporary artists, there's much more diversity in what there used to be. We have African American artists, we have many more female artists, we have LGBTQ artists. Okay, it really helps open up kind of that diversity book that's so important today. It really helps students to see artists that look like them. It also helps expose them to artists that might not look like them, kind of give them that different perspective. Also, artists today, they're using they're very innovative with mediums. They're using things that aren't very traditional. They're not necessarily painters or drawers. We're starting to see things like multimedia, video, sound, installations, technology, artists that even use gunpowder and use that to explode and make marks onto canvases. So these new artists are really thinking out of the box, using different kinds of materials that we had never thought about using before. We also see a lot more collaboration than ever before, artists working with artists, and that's something I try to promote a lot in my classrooms too. I'll show you a couple examples of mine in just a couple minutes, but I think it's great when artists work together and make some really awesome artworks. As I said before, students also see art as a potential career. Okay, there's something to try to talk about, that art isn't just somebody who can paint or somebody who can draw. There's graphic design, there's architects, there's interior design, there's fashion design. There are lots of fields to art other than being something that happened in the past. And last but not least, one of my favorite things that students like about learning about contemporary art is that we can actually contact these artists. They are alive. Many of them have social media. It's super easy to reach out to these artists. And in fact, I do that quite often. So here are just a few different examples of that. Here is one based on an artist named Sunny. I'll talk about him a little bit later, but I typically tag them in the post. And then here you can see Sunny sent back a few emojis. Sometimes they do emojis. Other times they actually do like a nice little write-up and respond back. Here's another one based on Jason Woodside, who's a mural artist. We'll talk about him later. And this one is probably my all-time favorite. This is an artist named Janet Eckelman. And she was actually the very first contemporary artist that I ever taught to my students. And she was actually one of the keynote speakers at NAEA a couple years back. And I had the chance to meet her and kind of tell her what my students were learning about. So she actually recorded a video with me just saying thank you to my students. Ignore kind of how awkward I look. I was just kind of like in a daze because I was so amazed that she was taking the like 10, 15 seconds just to say hi to my students.
Hi, Harmony and Consolidated. You did a beautiful, beautiful artwork in your room, and I wish I could lie underneath it and look up at it.
And we'll actually see my students' artwork inspired by Janet Eckelman later on. But a super awesome artist, very interesting to learn about. If you want to know about STEAM, she's like the epitome of that. Another thing I get asked about is, well, how do you find these artists? It's not just like opening up your art history book and seeing a Van Gogh or a Picasso. You can do that in any art history book. Finding contemporary artists is much, much harder. Okay, and yes, there are thousands of them out there, but it's hard to find some that are necessarily like appropriate for our students. A lot of them deal with some really heavy topics or some imagery that we might not be comfortable either teaching in general or at your respective grade levels. But some sources that I really like to use, my favorite is probably Colossal. Super great website. Even if you're not interested in teaching contemporary art, I would suggest following them on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, just so you can kind of see the articles they post. They post some amazing stuff. I love seeing it. Like I said before too, these are all hyperlinks. So if you have my PowerPoint, you can click on these. They'll take you right to the website. Boom is another one that kind of deals a lot more with like the design aspect to art. And yes, it does have a bunch of O's like that. So when you go to type it in, there are a lot of O's. The Jealous Curator is another one that many of you have probably heard of. It's pretty famous. Artsy. Going to various museum and gallery websites. Most galleries and museums have a section in their museum dedicated to contemporary art. So then a lot of times they also have that on their website too. You can go and view like an exhibition that's going on. That's kind of where I pull some ideas too. And last but not least, I use Pinterest a lot to find these artists. It's a great place to go and kind of pin them all to one board. You can click on that link and it'll take you to my board. Most of the artists on my board are contemporary artists. Some of them I'm just interested in general. Other times I pin them there because I want to use them as inspiration for my projects later on. But you're more than welcome to go on there and look too. Another great place to find ideas are from fellow art educators. I'm not the only one who deals a lot in contemporary art. I've put together just a handful of them on Instagram. Don Massey is one out of San Diego. He's kind of like the king of this. He's the one who got me into it. His handle is at ShineBrightZamorano. And then there are other art educators such as Joel Schulten. We'll see one of his projects. Sarah Krajewski is another great one. She's actually a great artist to actually teach to your students. My students actually learned about her last year, which is really fantastic. because she's one of my friends and a fellow art educator and has a very distinctive style. So she's somebody else to look up, and you could have your students kind of learn about her. Tasha Newton, Jordan DeWild, and Melissa Mastrolia, all other art educators that do a good job of incorporating contemporary artists in their curriculum. And I believe that all of them are elementary, except Jordan has recently switched to the high school, if I remember correctly. He used to be an elementary art educator. Another great thing about elementary art is it allows you to discuss events that are happening in the news. I like making sure that my students are aware of things that are happening in the art world as they occur. Notre Dame is a great example of that and the fire that occurred. So here is a project that I did with my students where we learned a lot about Gothic cathedrals and architecture and kind of what goes into a Gothic cathedral. Then we drew out the cathedrals however they wanted. They include bricks and pointed arches and bells and windows and things like that. And then I talked to them about radial symmetry, and they created radial symmetry on a CD, and we glued that on. We also then took a picture of Notre Dame and actually just whited out the roof of it. And then I put them in the role of becoming an architect. And how would, if you were that architect, how would you design the roof of the new Notre Dame? Okay, what would it look like? Would it be functional? Or would it just be something that looks cool? Okay, so this person was inspired by the stained glass. They made the stained glass roof for it. This person thought it'd be cool if it was a water slide. So you go up to the top and you slide down to the bottom. So just kind of a fun way to introduce things that were happening in the world and bring those things to their attention, as well as getting the chance to kind of look at those events more in depth. Stuart Semple and Anish Kapoor are probably one of my favorite things to talk about. If you don't know the backstory to them, they're really fun. What happened was Anish Kapoor, he's really famous for making The Bean. Not to actually call The Bean, it's actually called Cloudgate. The Bean's something that kind of makes him mad, but Stuart Semple's somebody who's all about making Anish Kapoor mad. But what Anish Kapoor did is he actually partnered with some scientists to create something called Vanta Black. And Vanta Black is a substance made out of nanocarbon tubes, so like little tubes of carbon that are like a seventh of a hair thick or something like that. And what happens is that when you apply it to materials, like over here, it becomes so black that it absorbs like 99.99% of light, essentially making it the second darkest thing in the universe outside of a black hole. So basically, when you apply it to something, it just looks black. It looks like it's been photoshopped out. Okay, so you can see the sculpture right here. It's supposed to look like this, but it just becomes a black, flat form because it absorbs all the light. Now, I said that Anish Kapoor worked with these scientists to create it, but what happened was that Anish Kapoor also bought the rights to that substance, so he's the only person in the entire world who can use that on art. And of course, that pissed a lot of artists off, that he had exclusive rights to this amazing black substance. So people reached out to this artist in, I believe he's in Britain, Stuart Semple, and they said, "Yo, Stuart, what can you do to help us? Because we know that you've been making your own paints for like 15, 20 years. So Stuart Semple actually invented something called the Pink is Pink. Okay, and you can see it right here. Now, when you go to buy the Pink is Pink on Stuart Semple's website, you actually have to sign a waiver saying that you are not Anish Kapoor. So by Anish Kapoor being the only person in the world who can use this Vanta Black, Stuart Semple creates this paint that anybody in the world can use except Anish Kapoor. And actually, when we look at this pink color, his pink is so pink that the pixels on your computer actually can't handle it. So if you were to see his pink in person, it would not look like this. Okay, it's actually more pink than this because your computer actually can't show that. And it's been a feud back and forth with them ever since. Anish Kapoor then stuck his middle finger in the pink and posted that to Instagram. So then Stuart Semple made the Glitterous Glitter, which was actual glitter made from little shards of glass in hopes that Anish Kapoor would stick his finger in that one. So they've been kind of going back and forth at each other for several years now. One thing that I get a kick out of is like every week Stuart Semple puts out a new event to do something to the bean. Like one week it was paint the bean, the pink is pink. Another time it was, put a blanket on the bean. He's done all kinds of like weird things to the bean that he always turns into Facebook events that you can attend. Now, I use that as inspiration for my students, and this is actually a Cassie Stevens project where they used gauze wraps and paper plaster, or plaster of Paris, or the name of it is escaping me right now. And we used a toilet paper tube and actually made our own tubes of paint. And then we just experimented mixing colors, and students had a class to try and find the color that they wanted to paint their paint tube sculptures. And then when they're all finished, I also let them name it. So this one's called Izzy's Beach Peach, obviously based on kind of that peachish color. And one more event that kind of happens in the news that I like to bring up is the Brussels Flower Carpet. Now, this is an event that happens every other year, so it's a biennial event. And one day, a bunch of people get together and they use begonias, which is the country's flower in Belgium. And they use these begonias to create these geometric flower carpets, is what they call it. And they do this, like I said, once every other year. Typically, the designs are based on another country and their relationship with Belgium. And because they're using flowers to do this, it's very temporary. This only lasts for like 2 or 3 days before these flowers start to wilt, and then they go and they clean them all up. So this is one I like to teach about symmetry, and we talk about warm and cool colors. So my students practice that, and then we just touch it up with some little details using some colored pencils at the end. Another thing that my students love to do every year is the Art Madness tournament. It's based off of March Madness, which is the big basketball tournament that happens every March, where they narrow down the best college teams in the nation. So I kind of do the same thing with artists. So every year in my classroom, I hang 6 artists from my ceiling, and that's because I have 6 tables in my class. So each table is named after an artist. And each year there's a different theme. So it might be contemporary female artists, which we see right here. These are both contemporary female artists. It might be contemporary black artists. It might be architects. It might be pop artists. And I use those 6 artists as well as 4 more artists that fit that theme to create a big bracket. And then over 2 days, without making any art, we just learn about each artist. So I give like a quick 2-minute spiel on each artist, kind of like who they are, what they make, why they make it. And then students vote. And we slowly narrow down our bracket until we finish one half of the bracket one day, and then the other half of the bracket the other day. And then we vote on our favorite, our champion. After each vote, I make students explain why they voted for one particular artist over another. Every student is expected to explain their reasoning at least once throughout each class period. So it's a really great way to have them make a stand on something, defend why they like one artist, kind of vocalize why they like an artist over another. My students really get into it because they start to get committed to certain artists and they really want to see their artist win. So that's a really great way to introduce not just one artist, but 10 artists. Because a lot of times these artists that I have hanging from my tables, we don't necessarily get a chance to make an artwork inspired by them. So this gives them a chance to at least have like a basic knowledge of who they are. Now, I did write an article for the Art Class Curator a few years back, kind of detailing like how I go about doing that. And I believe I even included the contemporary female artists. So you can actually pull my 10 female artists that I used that year, as well as the write-ups on them, and you could just pick up and do this right off the bat. So you're welcome to check that out. So when I am teaching contemporary art, typically I am talking about my 3rd grade students. So as I said, I am a K3 art educator, and I do sprinkle in contemporary artists in kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. But my big focus in 3rd grade is the contemporary art. So actually my 3rd grade curriculum is 100% contemporary. They don't learn about anybody who's dead. And then I kind of focus more on those more traditional artists in kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade, just with a few contemporary artists sprinkled in throughout there. So this is kind of like the meat of my presentation. My hope for you is that you can walk away from this presentation and walk into your classroom on a Monday and have loads of ideas to do with your students. So I'm going to talk kind of fast because I have tons of artists that we probably won't get through all of them. But I'll kind of explain a little bit about each one of the artists and then kind of how I go about teaching that project and kind of the takeaways that I want from my students. So this first artist, his name is 1010, and 1010 is a graffiti artist from Germany, if I remember correctly. Now, 1010, he's an anonymous, which my third graders always think is cool that we don't know who he is. Third grade is also really into street art. They kind of like that idea that's they're doing things illegally and kind of they're secretive about their work. So that's a great way to inspire and kind of get your students more engaged is to give them some street artists. So 1010, he typically creates these murals that almost look like portals. And with my students, I kind of talk about how he uses a lot of value in his work. And by changing the value and slowly shifting through his colors, he can kind of create that sense of depth in his work, where there's a sense of space to it. So I use this as an opportunity to introduce my students to analogous colors. And then they choose some analogous colors and slowly shift from through those values of those analogous colors. And when they do this, they typically start with a black shape. Okay, and they can do organic or they can do geometric. And then they cut out that black shape so the student chose like a triangle. And then they put that on the next color and it gets a little bit bigger, bigger, and bigger until it obviously gets very large. When I have the students do this too, we actually glue little pieces of cardboard in between each layer. So when you look at these in person, they are actually three-dimensional. They do kind of pyramid up off of the paper. Richard Serra is a pretty well-known contemporary artist. He is from the East Coast somewhere, and he grew up, or his father was a steel mill worker, and he also did some occupations that related to working with steel in college and kind of helped pay his way through college. Now, his artwork is used to kind of mess with your sense of space a lot, which is kind of a different concept for my students. Usually when we talk about space in my class, we talk about things being close to us and far away from us, but we don't talk about your personal space as much in art. And his these huge steel walls, they really mess with your sense of space. So a lot of times, the walls might tilt over you, they might tilt away from you, they might get really skinny, they might get very far apart. And I kind of try to have my students think about how might you feel walking around or through his sculptures? How would your sense of space really change? You might feel claustrophobic in areas, you might feel very open in areas. I also like too how when you really get above his work, like a bird, it's really like it's almost like a line design actually. So my students actually sketch out a couple different designs. They can do more organic lines or geometric lines, whatever their personal style is. And then we use brown strips of paper and cut these little flanges into it. And then they glue them down. So when you see these in person, these little brown strips actually stick up like a ½ inch off of their paper too. My students like this one too because sometimes we'll get marbles out and you can almost use them like little marble mazes and kind of roll your marble through these because the little pieces of paper will stop the marbles. Maya Hayuk, is probably one of my favorite artists. She is based out of Brooklyn, and she's pretty young, probably like in her mid to late 30s, I would think. She does a couple different styles of paintings. I'll show you kind of a digital version of that I do of her later on. But here is one of her paintings off to the left. Now, she typically does these like diagonal lines where she uses this really watered down, thin paint. So as she does that, you can actually see the through the paint and the different layers underneath it. So I kind of like her ability to layer. She also does a lot with value too, and by changing those values, she almost creates like that sense of space within her work. So kind of those desaturated colors with some of these more vibrant colors. And she has this thought that as the world gets darker and darker and all these bad things are happening, she feels that her artwork needs to get brighter and brighter to kind of counteract that. So this is a project that my third graders do. They've learned about symmetry in the past, but this is just kind of a refresher for them. And then this typically leads into a more complex symmetry project later on. So we just take simple strips of paper and practice gluing like a V shape and go either direction. And kind of alternating going up and down, and it almost creates almost like this weaving type look. Typically we do this over 2 days, and I'll give them some more like tinted or pastelish colors to start with, and then as they keep working on these on the second day, I'll introduce some neons and some more saturated colors, so they also get kind of that sense of depth too, and once again kind of focusing on just a very basic symmetry. Here's that other Maya Hayuk project. This is one that I actually got from Don Massey, who I mentioned earlier. Super fabulous art educator. Make sure to check out his website, Shine Bright Zamorano. You'll actually see a few of his projects throughout this presentation that I really enjoy. So Maya Hayek, she does make these kind of diagonal paintings, but she does do some murals too where they're broken down more into like or geometric shapes. So what I do is I use an app called Assembly, and that is on an iPad, and it used to be free. I'm not sure if it still is or not. You'd have to check. But in that app, you can actually take photographs and then place like vectors and shapes on top of photographs, or just on top of a white canvas if you'd like to. But I actually take a picture of one of our walls on our school, and then send that out to my students, and then they actually create symmetrical murals based on Maya Hayek. Now you see that this one's not symmetrical, but I still kind of focus on that symmetry with them. So that's just another way to kind of do a digital version of symmetry too. Lean Iris Victor is probably another one of my favorites, and she does a great job too of responding back to my students. She's pretty young. She's like 32 or something like that. So my students love that she is about their parents' age. She uses a very limited color palette. So she uses 24 karat gold, this very particular kind of blue, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head, and then black, and then once in a while she uses white. On top of her paintings, she also then sometimes just photographs herself in front of them, but she won't just like stand in front and take her picture. She will like decorate her body to kind of match the painting. So she'll wear lots of gold. She'll paint her body with blacks and blues. She'll wear jewelry that kind of represents those things. So when I teach my students about Lean Iris Victor, they can choose whichever colored paper they want. They don't have to do blue. But then we talk about using very simple shapes, which is something I like about hers. That is super duper simple shapes, and just by like overlapping them and the way she sets up her composition, it ends up looking really complex and sophisticated. So that's something we talk about a lot about, is using different size circles, using rulers, and using that overlapping to make a sophisticated looking composition, and being aware of what parts we should paint and what parts we shouldn't. Because when I give them gold paint, the first instinct is they want to paint everything. Okay? And then we talk about how artists really have to limit themselves. They have to be thoughtful about it and save some of those areas so we see their background paper, so we can add black to it. She was recently in the news too, because Kendrick Lamar wanted to use one of her paintings as inspiration for one of his music videos, and she said that she didn't want that to happen, and he did it anyway. So she actually took him to court and won a bunch of money, which is really great. And I'm glad I think it's really cool that she stood up for herself and her artwork when a very famous rapper wanted to use it. So she was recently in the news about that too, which is another great way to kind of tie the news into your classroom. Julie Muratu, another one of my favorites. You notice that a lot of times the artists I like to teach about are the artists that I enjoy. I feel like when I'm teaching artists that I don't particularly buy into, my students kind of pick up on that too. And we will probably run into a couple artists that I don't technically buy into in this presentation. But so far, a lot of artists that I really dig. You've probably seen Julie Muratu's work before. She has a fantastic Art 21 episode that if you haven't checked that out, you should. Her artwork is typically photographs and blueprints and different architectural drawings that she layers on top of each other. And then she'll pick and choose like little bits and pieces to fill in with ink or with paint. And then she like layers it and layers it and layers it and layers it. It almost creates like this sense of space in her work. Now, what my students do is I've printed off like 20 large cities around the world from Google Maps. So you can kind of get like that 3D function on Google Maps where you can see the buildings actually pop up when you look at the map. So I do that for about like 20 big cities, places that they might want to go someday. And what they do is the first day they take a sheet protector, so like those see-through plastic sheet protectors, and they slide their map into it. And then they use Sharpies to pick out little details and fill it in. The next day they choose another map and they slide it in the other side of that sheet protector, so they're working on the back side this time. Once again, pick out little bits and pieces to color. And then the final day, I give them a see-through transparency. They pick out a third map. Once again, pick out little spots to color in. And then they slide that transparency into their sheet protector. So they end up getting 3 different layers of maps on their work. I really like how sophisticated and kind of complex these can look as well, just by using these little itty-bitty shapes. This artist that I put right here, my little student, I was really drawn because sometimes they're very thoughtful about their colors, Other times they want to use like every single color they can, but I'm always really drawn to the ones that are very particular and thoughtful with the colors they use, because this is like a 3-day project for them, and the fact that they can kind of stick to that color scheme throughout those 3 days I always find very interesting. Chuck Close, probably don't need to talk about him too much. You've probably seen or heard of him. He's very, very well known for his hyper-realist drawings, as well as his, what would you call it, almost like a checkered painting, where typically he works with portraits of people. He has something called prosopagnosia, which means that he has spatial blindness. So when he looks at people, he can't recognize them by their face. So he has to recognize people by other things like their hair, their mannerisms, what they're wearing. And by painting these pictures of people, that's a way for him to kind of help identify and kind of decode their face. So my students, I actually printed off a picture of them. This is something I like to do for art shows at the end of the year. I typically do an Artome show where parents can actually buy the students' artwork matted and framed. So I want every student to be really successful with that, because it's going to be shown to everybody. So a lot of times I find that working on top of a black and white photograph of themselves is a great way to do that, because it kind of gives them, you can see those details, and then it kind of offers some of those values too. So here the student cut out a picture of themselves, we glued it down, and then I told them to choose, either you're going to use warm colors in the background and cool colors on your face, or do cool colors on your face, warm colors on the background. They put little designs using 2 colors in each little square, and then they had to pick like a color scheme for their hair, color scheme for their clothes. So this was drawn right on top of just a black and white photo that was printed off of out of the printer. Kind of the same thought process. Here's another one that I did, working right on top of a photograph. This artist's name is Eduardo Cobra. He is from Brazil, if I remember correctly, and he takes pop culture people or very iconic photographs and then gives them almost like this kaleidoscopic effect, where we see these really bright colors. A lot of times we see that like that sunburst behind them. It's very, very bright. And so my students did the same thing. I kind of talked about using one spot kind of in the middle of your paper, or I guess they put that spot wherever, and then making kind of that explosion effect. Then we gridded out our photograph using crayons, and then they use watercolors to fill those in. So because they're using watercolors, we have some of that transparency, so the details and the values show through their watercolors then. And this was another one that was used as an Artome art show that parents could purchase. Retna and Elmac, they are actually 2 artists that collaborate together. They also do make separate works. If I remember correctly, Retna is the one who makes the backgrounds. He has kind of created his own language, actually, made of symbols. We don't really know what those symbols mean, but he does the backgrounds. And then Elmac makes these highly detailed portraits of people. Typically, he finds inspiration for those people in the communities that he plans on painting those murals. He also does this very interesting mark making with his spray can, where you can almost see that kind of sweeping motion. Kind of leaves an interesting effect. So I had my students fill out almost like a questionnaire. It might have been like, create a symbol for 5 different things that are your hobbies, or a symbol for 2 of your favorite subjects in school. So they created their own symbol language, and then we used those to fill in the backgrounds. We talked a lot about self-portraits and proportions. I always start my 3rd grade year with self-portraits because I like to show them kind of that growth that we can have over a self-portrait project. And then they chose a mark that they wanted to make over and over and over for their self-portraits. And we also talked about monochromatic too, so because a lot of Elmac's artworks are monochromatic. Doho So is another one of my favorites. He also has a really fantastic Art 21 video. He was a South Korean artist that was displaced as a young boy, and he deals a lot with that displacement in his artwork. So he had this idea that, what if I could have taken my home in South Korea, packed it up in a suitcase, and just taken it with me? So he literally did that. He created his apartment or a home that he lived in South Korea out of like a silk or a mesh, and he made it to scale. So it, like this picture, this is literally like a 3-story house that he recreated. And he did just that. He recreated his home, packed it up in a suitcase, and he took it across the ocean to America with him. And now he's done lots of the places he lived. He's done like his apartments in New York. He's done like hallways to some of the places he's lived. And these are amazing. They had one in Madison, Wisconsin a few years back, and I got to go and see him talk about his work. Absolutely stunning when you can walk through the places he's lived, and he includes every little detail you can think of. You can see the thermostat. He stitches the numbers on the thermostat into the thermostat. When you look at the toilet, because it's mesh, you can even see through the toilet and see the piping that he's done in the back of the tank. It is one of the coolest art experiences I've probably ever had. Loved it. So my students created their dream house, the exterior to it. I very rarely do fibers to my students. I don't handle textures very well, and so fibers are not a strength of mine, but I did give stitching a shot with my students. So we drew out what we wanted our house to look like. Then they stitched into burlap what that dream house was. When they were done, I gave them blue construction paper and white colored pencils, and then they created blueprints for what the inside of that house would look like too. Jeff Koons. So I said there's going to be a couple artists in here that I might not buy into. Jeff Koons would be one of them. I did have the chance to see him a couple years ago at NAEA, which was, it's always cool to see an artist talk about their work. So I really enjoyed that. Jeff Koons is a neo-pop artist, most famous for his balloon figures that he makes, particularly his balloon dogs. Kind of plays with this idea of immortality, because when we think of a balloon or a balloon animal, when they have air or they have breath in them, they have life, but once that air runs out, they kind of die. They no longer cease to exist. So by creating that thing that's usually temporary, like a balloon, by creating out of metal, it takes on this immortality that it never deflates. It lasts for forever. So the first year I taught him, my students, I came into school super duper early each day, and I actually blew up balloon animals for them. And then we worked on paper macheing them, and then they could paint them afterwards. Pretty cool project. Kids loved it, but it was so much work to do that. The kids just aren't old enough to do their own balloons, so me having to do that, and then we'd get halfway through one of the sculptures and then pop, and then we'd have to do the back half to it, and then we'd have to like surgically put them together. It was a ton of work. I don't necessarily recommend it, but the kids did love it. But since then, I do glue drawings of them, so I talk about how to break that balloon dog down into ovals. Okay, and then we really talk about form and how we can make something, even though it's two-dimensional, we can make it look three-dimensional by giving it highlights and giving it shadows. So we use chalk then to fill in that glue drawing. So that's just some of my third grade projects. There are many more. You can check out my website for them. I'll kind of jet through second and first and kindergarten real quickly for you. So second grade, Tim Burton's a great one. He's one of my favorite movie directors. A lot of the kids have seen movies of his too, like The Nightmare Before Christmas and Corpse Bride. This is a fun one to do right around Halloween time. I talk a lot about his German expressionism style and how oftentimes in his work things are very crooked, they're at weird angles, and by doing that he creates this kind of unnerving effect with his work. So I show the students how to create a haunted house using those kind of diagonals and things in weird places. We also create a value landscape. So this is really the first time I introduce using value as a way to create space in second grade. So we use values to create a landscape, and then they create a silhouette of a haunted house. And then we finish it off with some yellow windows and Sharpies to add any little spooky details that they'd like to add. Bridget Riley is an op artist, and she most typically works with black and white, not always though. Kids love op art. They find it so cool that it looks like it's moving. So I would recommend definitely doing some kind of op art with your students, whether it's Bridget Riley or something else. So what we do is we do a weaving, but instead of having a weaving where the cuts in the loom are just straight, I'm going to make just some funky cuts into it, and then we use black strips to weave into that, so we get that black and white checkerboard, but you can see kind of those funky cuts. The weavings themselves are really cool. You can just leave them like that. Sometimes I have students then take a black or white sheet of paper and cut a geometric shape out of it, and then they can glue that on top, so then they get, like this student did a heart, so then they get their op art in just like a shape that they choose. Invader is another super rad street artist. This is another one I got from Don Massey that I really liked, and I've done some other projects with Invader that we'll probably see coming up in a slide or two. Invader is an anonymous street artist, and he uses just very simple bathroom tiles to create mosaics that he then puts up around the world. Now, when he does it, he doesn't just put up like one mural in one city. He calls it an invasion, where he'll go to like San Diego and he'll put up like 10 of his little Invader characters all over the city. So he really puts up a whole bunch of them in one location. So my students, I gave them a graphing paper that was all gridded out, and then we worked on, first off, just trying to recreate some of the characters, because a lot of them are very symmetrical. So we practiced symmetry with that, and then they ended up creating their own. Then we took those characters and rolled out, I did this for them because I thought it'd be too hard. I ended up rolling out 7 by 7 inch pieces of clay tiles for them, which was a ton of work. I don't have a clay tile, or I don't have a clay, the roller thing. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name right now. So I did hand throw all of those tiles, which was a terrible idea. I don't recommend it. Definitely get like a clay press if you have that, or a clay roller. But each student then got a 7 by 7 inch tile, and then they took Legos and pressed that in to create the blocks for their Invader character. And then we talked about contrast and making sure that their character stood out from the background after we painted them. Damien Hirst, another artist that sometimes you just love to hate. He's most famous for his dead animals, where he takes a dead animal and puts it in formaldehyde. And by putting it in formaldehyde, it makes that animal last for a very long time. And he's kind of, a lot of times, his shark is probably the most famous. Playing with that idea that if you saw a great white shark in the ocean, you're probably in pretty big trouble. But when it's almost like you're being able to look death in its face, and because technically that shark's dead, but you can get right up in its face and it looks like it's alive. Now, one thing I like about Mr. Hirst is that back in the 90s, he dressed up as a clown and went to a fair or a circus, and people could pay him to make spin paintings. So just a table that spins and it pushes the paint out using centrifugal force. And when the people were done paying and making their spin painting, then he took those spin paintings and autographed them. And people didn't realize that they were walking away with a Damien Hirst painting, essentially. This is a great way to tie in science, too. The idea of centrifugal force is pretty cool. So my students and I will actually take like a bucket of water outside, and I'll swing it over my head over and over, and they're amazed that the water doesn't fall out of it. Kind of that same idea with paint, how it pushes it outwards. So this is one I do at the beginning of the year with my second graders to refresh their memory on mixing the primaries to make secondaries. So we make 2 spin paintings by putting primary colors onto a paper plate, and then they put that plate down on a sheet of paper and spin it with their hand. And as they rotate that, some of those colors start to mix, and they get those secondaries. So instead of just mixing it with their paintbrush, which they've done loads of times, this is kind of a fun way for them to experiment to kind of make new colors. Now in second grade, they also raise butterflies at the start of the year and kind of learn all about them. So I tie that into the classroom because Damien Hirst sometimes cuts his spin paintings into other shapes. So then we cut ours into butterflies and talk a lot about symmetry. So I teach them how to, paint half of it, fold it so it prints on the other side, and we do that over and over until we get 2 or 3 butterflies that we then glue down. Heather Hansen, this is another Don Massey project, but it's such a great one that I like to use. She is a dancer as well as an artist, and she is very much about creating symmetry with her body. So she makes these very meditative movements. It's almost like a performance art as well, where she makes the same movement over and over and over, and then turns around and does it the other direction. So she makes these symmetrical artworks. They go bilaterally, where it's symmetrical on the top and the bottom, as well as the left and the right. So I face my students across from each other, and one becomes the leader. And if one moves their arm out to the right, then the other one does the same and mirrors them. You can do it on a sheet of paper. Otherwise, this is a great one to do in the spring when it starts to warm up. So I just have students do it right on the sidewalk. And kind of in that vein is Tony Orico, who is known as the human spirograph. So he lays on the ground and moves his arm. So he creates those spirographs, which are very popular in the 90s. So I teach my students that they can do the same thing, that by laying on the ground and then swinging their arms and slowly rotating, it creates these cool spirographs. They can also do it by kneeling too and just kind of swinging their arms back and forth and slowly rotating, that they can create the same effect but in a different size. Once again, it's a great thing to do outside when it's starting to warm up, because in Wisconsin, we don't usually have a lot of time outside that we can make art, so I really try and take advantage of that once it gets warm outside. Frank Gehry is an architect very famous for his titanium buildings. We talk about the Bilbao effect and how, because he built this museum in Bilbao, that people will come from all over the world just to see that building and how that impacts the economy. He's most well known because his buildings feature a lot of like these wonky angles that has a really great sense of movement to it. So my students, they take a shiny piece of paper, which once again, that's like gold in the art room. They love shiny paper. And they create like this organic squiggle that overlaps all over their paint or all over their artwork with a Sharpie. And then all the little weird shapes that leaves, they then use vertical and horizontal and diagonal lines to fill those in. So it kind of looks like the paneling on this. Then they cut out that weird organic shape and cut a few slits into it, and then they can curl it around their pencil. They can bend parts of it, so they kind of create this little form. So this is actually the first time I switched my students from saying something's 3D to telling them that that thing has form. So that's kind of a new word to them. They know what 3D is, but trying to start to shift them towards saying that has form, just trying to use that word instead. Now, Mars Jr., this is the one I got from Deep Space Sparkle. He is an illustrator that deals a lot with pop art as well as architecture. Kids really like seeing his pop art stuff too. He does a lot of Star Wars things. But what I like is illustrative style, where he uses like one flat color for the background, and then he'll make one thing that's white. And we talk a lot about how that creates an emphasis or a focal point for that artwork. He also does a really great job of showing space too. So I talk about to students about how can we make something look further away with our buildings. We can make the buildings overlap. We can change the size of the windows. I also show them how to draw that building three-dimensionally. I'm giving it some sides. And then we obviously add a white building on top of it then too. Usually I try to really make them emphasize making sure that white building is their very, very best building, and adding some kind of cool detail to it that keeps our attention. This student doesn't look like they did that though. Kehinde Wiley, another artist that is super popular right now, African-American man that grew up frustrated because he didn't see people like him in the art history books. So he takes old paintings from masters and then puts them in with contemporary. It started off as just contemporary African-American men, but now he's branched out and includes African-American women as well. Recently painted the Barack Obama portrait that is hanging up in the National Portrait Gallery. Now, this is the one I saw on Facebook somewhere, and I can't remember who the art teacher was, but it's such a fabulous one that I love to share it. So what I did was we took pictures of each of the students. They could pose how they wanted. I took that photograph of them, and then they took a piece of transparency, put it on top of their photograph, and they outlined all of their details. Then I took that transparency that they used, and I put it on the copy machine. And what happened was then it went from a transparency to a line drawing on a white sheet of paper. And from there, they could add the pattern backgrounds like we see with Kehinde Wiley. They could use watercolors to fill that in. This is another one of those ones that I did for the Artome Art Show. I liked it because they could trace off of their photograph that they were using, so I knew that everybody would be able to do that and have a super successful self-portrait. So really great way to do that. I've done a few different variations of Kehinde Wiley in the past. Sometimes we just draw self-portraits and then like stamp a background, but lots of different ways to teach him. But he's a very interesting one. Sonny, we saw him earlier. He's another one who reaches out to my students. Typically works with primary colors, so this is kind of a refresher for my students. I always start with a primary color project in first and second and third grade, or first and second grade, just to refresh their memory from the summer. I am always drawn to this one that he did with these music symbols. This is a great kind of history lesson for students too. A lot of them don't know like what a record player is or what a cassette tape is, so I kind of bring those things up and talk to them about those. Then we use bingo daubers to create some of those symbols. This was also something I did the first year I did it. We had a new music teacher, so I kind of want to do something that kind of like welcomed her. I want to have something music related hanging up in the hallways, so they could come up with their own symbols as well. So they traced it with a black bingo dauber, and then we used liquid watercolors to paint that in afterwards. Lalu Shabanjo, I'm hoping I say that right. It's been a while since I had to say it, so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. This is the one I got from Joel Schulten, and I mentioned him at the beginning of the presentation. He does a lot of really great things. His students' work is amazing, too. But Laulu is an artist who I believe originally came from Africa, but now lives here in the United States. And he paints right onto people. Really, he'll paint on anything. I think he did some work for Nike, came out with shoes like that. He does his work on jackets, paints right on people's faces. He did a lot of work for Beyonce, actually, in one of her music videos, if I remember correctly, painting her dancers' faces and bodies with that paint. And he typically chooses patterns that like mean something to him. So this was another one of those Artome shows where I wanted to work on top of photographs. So we took a picture of my students, and actually this is just their school picture, and then I showed them kind of how to create this general outline of their face, and then we filled it in with some small detailed patterns. I'm super blown away by this second grade artist. This is probably one of my favorite artworks that's been produced in my classroom. She knocked it out of the park. First grade, we're getting close to the end here, so hang in there. This is one I got from Jamestown Elementary. Another great lesson to do to start the year off with. James Rizzi is a pop artist who makes these fun, bright, colored cityscapes, and he then puts these kind of fun or crazy faces on them because he found that growing up in New York City that it's kind of a boring city. All the buildings kind of look the same. They're gray. There isn't necessarily a lot of character to them. So he began to add these fun faces to them. This is a great way to introduce space to my students. So I talk about a foreground and a background. And then we also refresh on that rainbow order from kindergarten. So they create 3 buildings in the foreground, and those are the ones that have the faces on them. And then 3 buildings in the background. And then, yeah, we paint those in the rainbow order. So that's just a little practice for them. Dale Chihuly, super famous, very popular, lots of different ways to teach him. He's a glass artist, very inspired by nature, has an amazing museum out in Seattle. Had the chance to see that when we were out there for NEEA. My variation of this is that we use transparencies. I just sent out a mass email to the school district asking if anybody had old transparencies that they weren't using anymore. Odds are there probably are a lot of people in your district who have boxes of them that aren't using them. So I got a whole bunch of them, and then we just use Sharpies to create some designs and patterns on them, and then I draw a spiral on it for them. I like to do the spiral because sometimes I make big spirals, sometimes I make tighter spirals. That way I get different lengths. So when the student cuts on that spiral, they get this long transparency strip. And that way I can kind of have control over how many long ones there are, how many short ones there are. So it's not just all the same shape. And this is what I like to do in the spring too, after the snow melts, because we have this awesome courtyard with these nice windows, and it looks great when the sun shines through it. Janet Eckelman, she was the one who had that amazing thank you video at the beginning of my presentation. This is the very first contemporary artist that I ever taught. I actually was awarded a grant through the the Weavers Guild or the Fibers Guild. The name is escaping me off the top of my head, but they donated a bunch of money to the Wisconsin Art Education Association to give towards art teachers who wanted to do a fibers-based project. Now, Janet Eckelman said before, she's the epitome of STEAM. If you look up I think she's got some TED Talks, like all the science and math and everything that goes into making her artwork possible is amazing. It's awesome. But she creates almost like this netting type material that then she suspends over like courtyards or over big areas of the city, and then projects lights on them at night. And it's really amazing to see videos of these when they catch the wind. They're kind of blowing. She's also found too that when she puts these in a place that they actually find that there's less crime in that area because more people go there to observe them and Just something about it that it actually reduces crime. So I'm very lucky in my school. I have these exposed ceilings, which I love. It makes it very tall and airy. So what we did is we took snow fencing, which is kind of like a plastic fencing, and I cut up a bunch of strips of paper or of cloth. And then this is just a very simple weaving project for my first graders. I really like is the snow weaving. The holes in it are so large that it's very easy for them to do it. They can also go up and down. They can go side to side. They could weave diagonally. They could do several colors within each hole. So it's just a very loose, open-ended weaving project. And then when they're done with them, I tie them up to the ceiling and I twist and I turn them so they kind of create these different forms as they hang from the ceiling. I secretly use cool colors with the weavings to hope that it kind of like mellows them out in my classroom, but I don't know if that actually works or not. Gerhard Richter is another great way to teach color mixing to my first graders. Instead of doing the traditional mixing colors with a paintbrush, what we do is we paint a couple sheets of paper with the primary colors, and then they take a piece of cardboard and scrape it a few times, and those colors start to mix. That's something Gerhard Richter does. Is he does layer after layer after layer, and then uses a squeegee to scrape his paintings, and that mixes some of the colors. It removes some of the layers, so you start to see the history to it. This is just a really fun way for my students to mix. Then I typically take one of their paintings and I cut it up into strips, and then we actually create a weaving where we weave one of those painted papers into another one of their painted papers. Reggie Laurent, great way to introduce organic and geometric shapes to my first graders. He is out of Georgia, if I remember correctly, but they create a collage using organic and geometric shapes and then fill that in with some very fine patterns. Peter Max, well known for his pop art, these kind of bright, painterly, sometimes they're people. He's done a bunch of Barack Obama, Statue of Liberty, lots of different things that he's done. So what we did is we created a painted paper that had cool colors, another painted paper that had warm colors. They chose which one they wanted to be their background and which one they wanted to be for their self-portrait. The one on the background, we then used bubble wrap to print polka dots all over it. So they painted a design on it and then printed it. And then we practiced drawing, or we drew a self-portrait onto the one that they wanted to use for their self-portrait, whether it's the warm or cool. And then we used oil pastels to color in parts of it. So I emphasized coloring in the eyes, the mouth, the hair, the shirt, but then leaving that skin tone so we still get some of that paint color through it. And last but not least, kindergarten. I do get a couple of projects in with these guys. This is one I don't remember where I saw it from. It was at NAEA about 5 or 6 years ago that I got this idea, and I loved it because I love Nick Cave's work. I've seen him talk about his work a couple times, and it always just fascinates me. But after the Rodney King riots, he became very aware of his skin color and how that could be perceived. So he began to make these things called sound suits. So by wearing them, it kind of hid what race he was. He grew up with a lot of brothers in his family too, and he was kind of the youngest. He always got hand-me-downs. So growing up, he kind of learned to fix his own clothing by sewing. So he starts to create these sound suits too by like stitching and sewing found objects onto them that he'll find out on the streets. And then he also performs in them too. So he makes these really awesome videos of him and his other dancers like doing choreographed dances in them. So in kindergarten, I set out a bunch of foot-long rulers, and they just practice measuring out like a foot. So just the length of the ruler, and then they cut streamers. And then they just take a piece of tape and they tape it all over themselves, as many as they can get for like one class period. And we just have a big old dance party at the end, which they love. Anytime Mr. Calvert lets us dance in class, they are all about it. So that's just a fun way to kind of talk about texture. We talk a little bit about movement, introduce them to like performance art. Jasper Johns, another very famous artist. This is how I introduce tints and shades to my kindergartners. So they start off by just painting tints and shades all over their paper using the primary colors. Next class, we use a small white brush, and they can paint as many numbers as they can think of, even numbers that are bigger than 100, which blows their mind. This is a great one to do for the 100th day of school, too, because there's usually such an emphasis on numbers at that point of the year in kindergarten. Then they use, I took a die cut machine and cut out 1 through 10 on it out of some like thick cardstock, and then they use those as a tracer, and they can color in some numbers using oil pastels like this. Then we glue a few numbers on that I die cut, so there's a 3 and a 2 and a 1. And then I also have some number stamps. So I just love this one because it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of different numbers in it. I don't know, I just find something very beautiful about these ones. It's probably one of my favorite projects that I do each year. All right, and I'm not going to go through my bonus projects. I will include these on my PowerPoint, so you're welcome to flip through them. They should be on my website as well, so if you are interested in them, you can always look them up there. Otherwise, you are welcome to reach out to me. But just a few more contemporary artists that I do that you might be interested in checking out. I really hope that you enjoyed my presentation. Hope you found some value in it. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I would love to help you. Like I said, I have videos for almost everything. I have write-ups for almost everything. I'm very easy to reach on my social media or on my email. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for having me. Have a good one, guys.